Good afternoon and welcome to today's webcast, the first in a four-part series looking at how you can prepare yourself and your organization for the future. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Tom Malnight. Tom, many thanks for being with us today. Your new book, soon to be published, The 3 R's of Preparing Your Organization for the Future, is based on extensive interviews that you've done with over 150 CEOs from different companies, different industries, different sizes of organizations around the world. What was the stimulus for conducting these interviews?
Okay, first of all, when we talk about these interviews, let's understand one of the things that we wanted to make sure is that we weren't just looking at one perspective. You know, right now in Europe we tend to think that we're all in the European world. When we're in South America, we think they're Asia, we think they're. What we did in this particular in this research project was we went off and talked to 156 CEOs or other senior leaders, but basically half of them were from what we would call the developed world today, and half of them would be what we call the developing world, the high growth world. And the reason was that for doing this is that those are two different worlds today. And more as we look to the future, you know, those two worlds are interacting. But at the same time, the issues that the companies are facing are similar. You know, in the research, what we wanted to do was we wanted to set out and say, you know, how can we look at the broadest possible audience, the broadest possible set of leaders and companies, so that we can say, how do we understand what are these issues of preparing for the future? If you look today, there's such a focus on the short term. And we see it in business schools, we see it in most of our interactions with companies today. You know, companies today are becoming exhausted. Companies today are working on initiatives right and left, are launching initiatives every which way. But the question is where are these taking them? And this pressure for the short term is becoming stronger and stronger and stronger. And our question for this research was, but where are we going? You know, where is all this activity, where is all this short-term focus taking us? You know, is it addressing these fundamental issues, or are we basically stuck in this short-term trap? There was very clearly two different types of organizations and leaders that we saw. And one, very clearly, what we said, they're holding on to the past. And those that are holding on to the past, basically what they're focusing on is how do I survive the challenges of today, based on leveraging what I've done in the past, based on leveraging what I know works from the past. And you know, the reason that they're doing this is those short-term pressures we're talking about. But so there's a number of companies that were holding on clearly. But we also encountered a number of companies that were what we call investing in owning the future. Now, investing in owning the future doesn't mean you forget about today. I mean, if you forget about today, it's suicide for any company. But what it means is that your focus is not just on what you're doing today, but where you're going as an organization, and how are you preparing for the future, and what are you doing to get yourself ready for what it's going to take to succeed, not just today, but it's going to take to succeed over time. And that's the ones that we are calling holding on to the investing and owning the future.
So let's look for a moment for the ones that are caught in what you're calling the short-term trap. What keeps them in there? What are the shackles that bind them to those short-term pressures?
We very clearly identified in the research what we call the gap. And there is a gap that the companies are facing today. You know, on the one side, there is dramatic pressure on the short term. Well, let's face it, face reality, there is. And this pressure that's on the short term, there's really three sources that we found in terms of what's causing this pressure. On the first side, there is this mounting pressure from the financial markets, and particularly from analysts and short-term traders are playing a bigger role in these organizations. And the issue that these companies face in terms of this financial market pressure is if I don't deliver, if I miss my results, my stock price can drop by 10 or more % in a day. And what it's driving is it's driving people to say, you know, I need to deliver consistency, I need to deliver predictability. And we used to say on a yearly basis, and then we started to say more and more on a quarterly basis, and now we're saying more and more on a weekly basis. But there's all of this pressure that we're facing there.
And what are the other forces at play? There
was two other ones that we saw that were very big. The second one, let's just look at competitive pressures today. And the reality is that in most industries today, we're facing pressures of commoditization, We're facing pressures of new competitors, oftentimes low-cost competitors coming in. We're seeing more and more demanding consumers who are asking us to do more and more, but willing to pay less and less for it. So they're asking us to do all of these things, but not willing to pay for it. We see technology leapfrogging taking place. There's a lot of competitive pressures that are coming on, and what that does is it hurts the budgets. It hurts your short-term budgets. So what we're seeing is that even in terms of maintaining what on a longer term perspective would be minimal growth rates, companies are having to work harder and harder. They're having to work harder and harder just to survive. So a second pressure for this short term is really these competitive threats, which are coming and which are real in most industries. But a third pressure, which I actually believe is probably the biggest pressure, is what we call the executive comfort zone. If you talk to most executives, what they like is they like answers, they like actions, they like predictability, they like using proven tools. And where executives are comfortable is, I know how to manage, I know how to do certain things. I know how to restructure a market. I know how to enter into a new country. I know how to launch a new product. And I know how to restructure and downsize my organization. And executives are very comfortable operating in that space because they have the tools that they've grown up with. They're the tools that we've taught them in business schools, or the tools that they've practiced throughout their careers, and it's what's worked, it's what's made them successful. So executives are very comfortable by using these tried and traditional tools that they have. And so this executive comfort zone is really the third source that we see in terms of what's holding people in this short-term trap.
So I guess a lot of people watching today will identify with that comfort zone and say, well, yes, that's kind of normal. That's what I'm asked to do. That's what I'm paid to do. Those are my objectives.
It's not what you're paid to do, though.
So tell us more about that. Why is it not what I'm paid to do?
If all you're paid to do is to manage what was given to you and produce results during the period that you're the leader, then that's what you're paid to do. But that's not leading.
So what is leading then?
What leading is if you look at what's happening for the future today, fundamentally there are long-term trends that are changing and threatening the world that we're going to live in. And if you look at what it's going to take to be successful in the future, in many cases it's fundamental changes from what we've done in the past. When we talk, we'll talk in the next webcast about some of these in more detail, but when we talk to leaders in the telecommunications industry, they'll tell us things like our competition in the future is not other telecom companies, it's internet companies. When we talk about who are going to be the consumers, and we talk about who are going to be these other players that are going to shape our future, they're very different than what they've been in the past. One executive, it's actually interesting because GE is oftentimes talked about as kind of a classic model of leadership, particularly in the 1990s and early 2000s, but they're also going forward. We talked to one senior executive from GE, and what they said is they've done a lot of studies of what it takes to be a successful leader today. And the single trait that they came up with that was most important was the ability to address ambiguity. That if you go into a situation today, if a leader today says, I need to know everything before starting, you're not going to be successful in a world that's volatile and changing. So the issue in preparing for the future, and the reason why there's the other side of the gap, the long-term side of the gap that's important, is that it's not based on just incremental change. It's not based on just tweaking a little bit my product. It's not based on just reducing my cost a little bit more. It's not based on entering one or two new markets. It's based on fundamentally relooking at your markets, your customers, your employees, your competitors, your relationship with society, all of these things, and figuring out how they're changing.
So what do I need to do to bridge that gap, to strike the balance between the short-term imperatives and the long-term thinking that you're explaining?
One of our key things is at the end of this challenge that we call bridging the gap, we talk about two critical issues that companies need to face, that leaders need to face up to. The first one, let me call it looking for the root causes, not the symptoms. What we see today is that many executives, what you do is, I identify a problem and I react to that problem. So here's a problem, we fix it. Here's a problem, we launch an initiative. Here's another problem, launch another initiative. Here's another one, launch another initiative. And we end up going after and we end up responding to all of these, what we call symptoms that are happening today. The question is how much are people spending the time to understand what's going on deeper? What's the fundamental trends behind this? What's the fundamental issues that are facing the company in the long term? And what we see is that by focusing only on symptoms and not understanding the root causes, the long-term trends that are happening, we basically end up with tired, short-term driven organizations in a world that requires more fundamental change. The second recommendation that we're coming up with to start this off is what we call two-directional thinking. And when we talk about two-directional thinking, we're talking about when we do strategic planning and we do thinking in many organizations, what we do is we start from where I am today and we say, what can I do? What can I do to move me forward? And everything is based on, okay, here I am today, let's incrementally, what does it take for me to grow 3% or 5% next year and the same for the year after that? And each part of my organization, how do you do that? And what we do is we drive our organization based on incremental change from today. When we talk about two-directional thinking, we're also talking about the responsibility of a leader is to have a point of view on the future. Harish Manwani, who's the COO of Unilever, and he was telling us that if you look at today, the days of being able to manage today by looking at the past are gone. These historical projections are gone. What it needs to do is you need to have a point of view on the future. You need actually to look around you in order to see what's happening so that you can understand where the future is taking you. And you need in order to start to plan more dynamically than you've ever done before. And then what we call two-directional thinking means is looking both, defining my agenda today, both based on what I can do and what I must do from today, but also what I have to do in order to get ready from the future. So thinking about what are the fundamental changes that are taking place in my industry, thinking about what are the types of capabilities I need to build, thinking about these longer term threats to my business, and building my agenda today, which reflects a combination of what I need to do to take care of today, what I need to do to deliver today, what I need to do to respond to today's pressures, but also preparing for the organization and yourself for the future at the same time. It's thinking in two directions, not one.
But what would you say to people who say, well, look, Tom, that sounds great, but it's really difficult for me to plan out even 3 years in advance. There's so much uncertainty. For me to have a 5-year vision or a 10-year vision, it's almost a waste of time because things are going to look so different down the road. How would you respond to that?
They're right. Things will change. But the question is does not being able to predict the future abdicate your responsibility for developing an understanding of the direction of change and where we need to prepare our organization for? It doesn't. Because the world is changing. So one way you can do is say, oh, I haven't met an executive yet, by the way, who can predict the future. I'd like to meet one sometime. It'd be nice. But what I have seen executives, and many executives that we talked to said, look, whether you're right or wrong, it's your responsibility to have a point of view on the future. And the point of view on the future has to be, you have to develop it because it's going to shape the direction that you're going to lead your organization going forward. If you don't have a point of view on the future and where the organization is going, all you're doing is maintaining the past, holding on to the past that we talked about. And what it means you'll be doing is it means you'll be reacting. I'll continually react to these issues. If you don't have a point of view on the future, what it means is that essentially you can never be proactive. And most of the successful executives, they don't have the 100% answer. But what they do is they're constantly being proactive to stay ahead of the pace of change that's happening in their organizations and the world around them.
Tom, you've conducted these interviews with companies all around the globe. How does the picture break down between developing markets and developed markets?
First of all, there was almost a night and day difference. But the interesting thing is that we did find what we call the future-oriented leaders in both worlds, but there were more of them in the developed world, in the developing world, and that's natural because what we saw is that when you're talking to a CEO from an Asian company that we talked to, what he basically said is, look, if we don't double our rate of growth every 2 to 3 years, we're going to become irrelevant in the future. Their ambitions for what they can accomplish are huge. We'll talk in the next webcast about one example of a company who had what we call the 10 by 10 strategy. Which meant, how do I grow 10 times in 10 years?
But are those ambitions that you're talking about, are they contextual driven, or is it about the individual, or both?
It's both. Because there is a reality that that when you're dealing in a market that's giving you a lot of domestic growth, that's funding a lot of your growth. And what we find is that the companies in these high growth markets, they are leveraging their growth in terms of the market, and they're expanding into other high growth markets. But what we also, and in the classic example of the European or of the Western CEO, oftentimes what they're doing is they're facing, how do I continue and survive in a 2% growth market? My domestic market is declining. How do I survive? And so you'd see ambition, the difference of ambitions right there. How do I have a low single-digit growth rate versus how do I have a growth rate of 25%? You do see that difference. And that's the reality of the contexts within which they operate. But we also saw a number of leaders in Europe and in the US who are also looking to the future, who are essentially reinventing their businesses. Their businesses are low growth as long as you stay in the traditional way we've defined them. As long as we stay in today's products and today's markets with today's customers, with today's mindsets and blah, blah, blah. As long as we stay in that refined, that very restricted world, it is a world of lower growth. But then we saw examples of leaders and companies who are breaking out of that definition. They were defining the growth opportunities based on how they were redefining their businesses and their markets. So we did, yes, there was more growth coming from the high growth market. That's natural. But it wasn't, you couldn't say that all the high growth leaders are in one country and all the low growth leaders are in another. No, we saw both.
And in your book, there are also some pretty sobering examples of companies who've tried to address long-term change with a short-term mindset and have become unstuck.
Yeah, one of the classic examples that many companies refer to today is Kodak. And there's this idea of how do I avoid having a Kodak moment? Because essentially, with the case of Kodak, you found a company that was a 100-year-old success story. And they were doing everything right. They were investing in technology, they were building their brand, they were taking care of their employees. So if you would look at what they were doing, they were doing everything right. But the question was, and they actually invented digital photography. Where Kodak eventually went broke was because of the threat of digital photography on their traditional business. And they invented digital. But what happened is that the way they held on to the past we talked about, the way they thought about, who are our competitors? Our competitors are the other ones that make film. It's Fuji. Who are our customers? What do our customers want? Our customers want to take pictures where, you push the button and we do the rest. Kodak, we take care of everything else. And pictures are for putting in albums and, pictures, there's a very traditional view of it. That world was changing. And because they were holding on to the past, what they did is they didn't start to recognize that consumers are completely different. They're looking for different things. They're expecting different things. They don't want me to do everything. They want to do everything. The idea of my competitors are not just Fujifilm. My competitors are all of the other digital players, or they're the internet players who are coming in and looking at this as a growth area. And what they ended up doing is, as soon as they started to feel pressure, from performance pressure and market pressure, they had to protect their cash cows. They had to protect back, and they had to focus more and more on how do we continue to make money from film, and how do we downsize, and how do we go to new markets with our old business models. And they never challenged really what is it going to take to be successful in this new world. They created a unit. They were spending, $500 million a year in digital technology in 1 year, investment in 1 year alone. But they never got to the point of how do I change my fundamental mindset, my business model, my view of markets, my view of competitors to stay ahead. And the result was they went bankrupt. And it's unfortunate because it was such a strong company.
And this is exactly what we'll be looking at in more detail next week when we start to talk about rethinking your playing field.
Exactly.
Tom, thanks ever so much for being with us today.
Good. Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us. If you'd like to be one of those informed and inspirational leaders, do join us next week for the second in the 4-part series. Thank you for joining us today. Bye-bye.